part 2. If Kundalini is awake, the pure potentiality of recognition of the absolute and undifferentiated awareness and tapping into grace and creativity and moving through all of your blocks and your limitations. If all of that is already possible, what is it that holds me back from being in it? Let's look at the 3 lower chakras. I can introduce this idea by simply suggesting that 99% of why you suffer is related to the first 3 chakras. Chakra number 1, the root center, down at the base of the spine, called Muladhara. Muladhara chakra. Mula means root, base. So this is the plane of aversion. Aversion is not a word that you and I use a lot, but imagine what you're averted, what you have aversion to. At the core of it is death. That's at the core. But with death, there's the big death, which is that I lose my mortality. I lose my life. But then there are all these small deaths. I lose things that I treasure. That the things I hold dear will be lost, or they themselves will die. Or the things that I dearly want in my life, I'll never have. So the whole plane of aversion, which we can distill down and say this is the plane of our greatest, smallest fears. The totality of my fears, what's at the root of the root pressure, the kundal, what is containing and limiting Kundalini. So that's where it begins. So just take pause for a moment. Make this real for you. Do you have anything? Do you spend any time with aversion? Do you spend any time dreading loss? Fearing your own demise? Fearing aging? Fearing losing those things and those ones that you dearly love? Certainly if you're a parent. Listen, we're all human beings, so we fear our own death. But if you're a parent, in some ways, it's even more real, the idea of potentially your child being threatened, their life, them losing their life. So yes, the answer is yes. We all have aversions, deep aversions. This is the core of our fears. So imagine now that all of that fear, though, is rising out of this limited perception of ourselves. But nonetheless, that fear sits on, compresses. It's the kundal. It's the coiledness of what is repressing that awakening. Okay, so that's just the first chakra. Now let's take the second. The second, Svadhisthana, so more or less at the top of your sacrum. And again, whether you want to hold fast to these ideas of chakras or just use them as a model, I'm fine either way. I wouldn't get too hard and fast on attaching to any idea. What do you really need to interface with the highest reality? That's what I would tell you is going to be the most meaningful. So now, the root center then, the second chakra, Svadhisthana, now is the place of the plane of our attachments. What am I attached to? Plenty. I'm attached to this body. I'm attached to things I like. I'm attached to my worldview. I'm attached to what I think is righteous. I'm attached to what I think is unrighteous. Goes on and on. I'm attached to the things that make me feel good about myself. I'm attached to the things that make the people who I care about feel good about themselves. Goes on and on and on. And just all I want you to do in this moment is just reflect for a moment. How much do you think about your attachments? How quickly do you reach for your phone to reassemble or get another like or get a small hit of dopamine in order to kind of get a temporary sense of satisfying some need? It's constant, isn't it? So, attachments. sit on this view of the absolute, this experience, this revelation of pure potentiality. And the final one we'll examine for this conversation is the third chakra, navel center, the center of ego, center of self-identity. And how much time do we spend with that? How easily are we thrown off by rejection? How easily are we thrown off how easily do we feel more significant when we receive positive feedback from someone or from the universe? Think about how much time your identity with your uniqueness, your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, your race, and how you constantly compare yourself to others. If we just take these three ideas, now we take this last sense of identity, and that sits on the universal mind that we until now have called awakened Kundalini. So that's the Kundal. Please again understand the takeaway should be that it's you that this practice works on. These techniques, the whole tradition, again, thousands of years old, of awakening to your capacity, to your vision of the infinite. What is holding that back is not that we have to pick on it. In fact, there's this third or fourth myth. I forgot. By now, I don't remember how many we're on. We're either on third or fourth myth that I want to dismantle, which is that when you interact with some methodologies that are called, and I'm putting air quotes, Kundalini Yoga, what you see is this kind of strategy that suggests, okay, Kundalini is at the base of the spine, we've got to wake it up, and somehow we have to aggravate it. We have to, I don't know. I mean, if you get around these schools that focus on this kind of approach, a very dualistic approach, where the Kundalini is there and somehow we have to either aggravate it or beat it into submission. The breathing is intense. You're activating the pelvic floor physically and very dynamically and very aggressively. You're doing all of these things to kind of stir that area and activate it, stimulate it, move it, take it on as almost as an enemy, as something that needs to be changed. Okay, well, it's a very dualistic idea to something that is fundamentally non-dualistic. So what is it that the tradition describes? Because I would tell you that's a non-traditional approach. Instead, what it is, instead of trying to work on aggravating that thing so it comes to life, because we've already dispelled the myth that that thing is asleep, what we're going to do is figure out how to purify, how to diminish the dross, D-R-O-S, the limitations of the first of those lower chakras. Your fears, your attachments, your aversions of attachments, and ego. And how do we do that? Okay, so now we're getting into the formula. And now what you'll see when you open, and by the way, these are no great secrets. In a sense, it's almost surprising in that in this day and age that we still have these old ideas. And there's no doubt that some of the ideas that were propagated by some of the modern approaches to Kundalini Yoga have kind of thrown us off in the understanding. But when you look to the ancient, when you look to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, for example, and that's a text that's easy to find, easily translated, and it's right there, that the work is in the navel center. It's not at the base of the spine. And why is that? Okay, so let's step back. The navel center, in addition to being what I described, again, stop this recording anytime, take a break, absorb it, make some notes, relax. I'm laying it all out here in these talks. Quite a bit for you to digest. Ultimately, perhaps Investigate through practice with a knowledgeable teacher. Here we go. Here's the formula. Navel center. In addition to being the center related to identity, ego, yogis actually described it, the tantrics described that center being dominant in the fire element. Yeah, fire element. Now, of course, we can't cut ourselves open and see a physical fire, but there is some aspects of fire that are very real. And the most relevant one is the fire of digestion. Now, if you're accustomed to, and if you learn some about Ayurveda, lo and behold, this is what they speak to a lot, which is what's called Jatara Agni. Jatara Agni. Jatara means stomach, and Agni means fire. So digestive fire. And if you think about it for a moment, and we're going to circle back, but this is really important. If you think about it for a moment, digestive fire is an amazing thing. You eat food. You don't really think about eating food. You just eat food, right? You don't think about what happens after you've tasted it. Once it passes your gullet, then it drops into the stomach, and lo and behold, some amazing thing happens. And one of the, really the alchemy of digesting food is extraordinary, which is you take in substance and your body somehow converts it into energy. You take in calories, which, by the way, is a unit of heat, and your body then uses heat and digestion, assimilation, to convert it into energy. Okay, so literally you're extracting the energy from the food through what's called Jatara Agni. Now, in terms of Kundalini Yoga practice, the methodical, traditional knowledge suggests that you have another potential Agni. This is called Bhuta Agni. Okay, so I know it's a lot. It's a lot of information, but that's why we needed to do this in a long format. And by the way, I do this, it takes me days to normally give people a living experience of it in which we can progress, not just through the understanding, but through the methodologies that eventually give rise to the experience of actual Kundalini Yoga. So now, what the suggestion, what the teaching is, and you can see it in these texts I've already mentioned. By the way, another one is the Gran Samahita. By working with prana in a very systematic way, for the purpose of this, I think it's going to be a bit much to describe it, but in short, there's this coming together of two existent energies in the body. Energy that's normally dominant in the chest, called pran. Energy that's normally dominant in the pelvic floor, called apan. The pran energy is warm and regenerative. It's internalizing. The apan energy normally goes downward. This is what helps you eliminate. This is what keeps you embodied. But it's normally moving down. That's the important thing to know. And through various tantric, yogic, hatha yoga techniques, bandhas, some of you might know what that is. The energy in the chest is brought downward. The energy in the pelvic floor is brought upward. And what the scriptures clearly say is when those two forces meet in the abdominal center, they create a unique force. They create Bhuta Agni. So, Agni literally means fire, but the etymology of the word Agni, that which moves me to the front of existence. That which moves me, if you will, past lethargy, confusion, darkness, not knowingness. That which moves me through, beyond the three waking states of waking, dreaming, deep sleep. Agni is what moves me toward Agni, which moves me forward toward the pinnacle of my being. In fact, Agni is the second word the second word in the oldest scripture on the planet, the Rig Veda, the foundation of these teachings. Om Agni, Mide. I meditate on the fire. That's which moves me to the front of existence. So that's Agni. Bhuta Agni. Unlike the digestive fire that allows you to convert food into energy, Bhuta means the past. It also means ghost. So fascinating. It's as if the mind's limitations are the very things, the influence of the past. So what is in the past? Our birth, our parents, psychology, our emotions, our life experience. In a sense, the influence of all that confines us, that haunts us. In fact, the word Bhuta means ghost, past or ghost. It's what limits us. So the Bhuta Agni is the fire that helps you digest your ghosts, that which maintains this sense of limitation. Okay, so I want to make sure you're with me at this point. Bhuta Agni, then, is the force responsible that as your Bhuta Agni develops, and this is why we're not looking for a one-off Kundalini Yoga experience, but rather this developmental, progressive, systematic, formulaic process of working with building energy in the abdominal center, specifically Bhuta Agni, that is the alchemy of one energy from your chest moving down, one energy from the pelvic floor moving up. And as these forces come together, it creates a force that we don't normally have access to. It ignites the fire that allows us to digest our own limitations, thereby reducing what's happening in those first three chakras. Now, as that kundal, as that coiledness, that compression begins to dissolve organically, we see more about ourselves. As we move beyond the plane of fear and aversion, attachment and ego identity, then lo and behold, universal awareness, intelligence becomes the leading edge of our perception. We move out of conditioned thinking into revelation, deep understanding, a relationship to what is normally hidden. Robert Swoboda once described it in one of his books. He described this in the book called Kundalini. He describes this idea, normally you and I are asleep to the infinite, awake to the finite. And as Bhuta Agni develops, dissipating, dissolving, diminishing, we could even use the word laya, dissolving the stuff, the cumulative force, downward force of our three chakras, our personality, etc., then we transform and we slowly become asleep to the finite and awake to the infinite. That's Kundalini Yoga in a traditional sense. It's very purposeful. It's very intentional. It's centered around the navel center. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that we're talking about a practice that is first written about 3,000 years ago. It comes into really a deep flourishing, though, in terms of scriptures and texts from about the 9th to the 13th century, what's sometimes called the Tantric period. I would argue that all Hatha yoga practice was meant to lead us there. That's what we see described again and again. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that just breathing a lot, doing rapid breath, isn't necessarily a practice about Kundalini Yoga. Kundalini Yoga, if it's done in this traditional sense, in the spirit of these deep teachings and this science, if you will, it's so far beyond just making us feel better. It transforms us. It literally allows us to awake to the infinite, to sleep to the finite. There are really three experiences of the universe that you and I have, right? We move through the world and we believe that our subjective experience is all there is. A great percentage of human beings live life that way. Then perhaps prayer comes into your life, or a deep experience. Perhaps you become a meditator. Perhaps something profound happens in the course of your life, in the course of moving through the world. And you go, well, you have this experience whereby you have a sense of being able to objectify your subjective experience. And then you kind of bounce back. Your sense of this is that, well, there's this possibility of objectifying my subjective experience. And so the things of the world and our points of view don't seem as real. We're not as kind of locked into them. But we go back and forth. Typically this, for most of us who meditate or practice, that's real. But then there's a third possibility, that if we look at a Buddha, Jesus, other saints, seers, that they continued to have this experience where they were in the world but not of it. That the relative view of the universe never fully overshadowed their experience of the universal. The universal experience became enduring, became permanent. So there are three things: pure subjective, subjective objective, and then pure awareness, never overshadowed by our individual experience. The awakening to Kundalini, not the awakening of Kundalini, but the awakening to, is a practice of undoing and dissolving your limitations. It's seated in the navel center. It's using these two forces intelligently, utilizing asana practice, bandha practice, pranayama practice. It's a very systematic approach that, if done under the guidance of a real teacher, a teacher who teaches systematically, really does begin to open your eyes into all that is possible, into that other 75% that generally remains unknown. I want to close the conversation just by saying, I'd like you to take away the consideration, if you're interested in these types of practices, again, that you do it with the guidance of an authoritative teacher in an authoritative system. Number one, and I haven't really spoken about it till now, but there are fundamentally, well, before I get to number one, let me introduce this. There are said to be two problems. My first teacher taught me this. There are two problems when it comes to Kundalini. The first is the problem of waking up to it. Okay, so that's not so much a problem, but it's the challenge that we live with. That unless we're systematic, we may never wake up. We may never wake up to that other 75%. We may never discover the genius within us, the vision of the absolute. That's the number one problem. The second problem is what to do when it awakens. Indeed, We don't want it to be happenstance. We don't want it to occur without a systematic approach. So, number one, for this awakening to be assimilable, for us to be able to assimilate that energy, the tradition teaches how vital it is that the central channel, the most powerful energy channel in the body, is open. This is called sushumna. Some of you know that term. Sushumna means sacred stream. And you see this in Taoist science. So if you've ever looked on an acupuncture chart, you see what's called the GV, which is more or less corresponding to the spine, but it's a meridian, it's a channel. And so in order for this awakening to happen, as that awakening happens, that channel needs to be open. So that introduces the number one principle for the systematic approach to Kundalini Yoga, alternate nostril breathing. Again and again and again, these scriptures tell us that we have to balance left and right. And we won't go into that in this conversation, just suffice it to say, we must balance left and right, because only when the left and right are balanced can energy enter that channel. And they say it takes a few years of regular practice of alternate nostril breathing. If you want the specifics described in the scriptures, 3 years if you practice it 4 times a day. Sunrise, midday, sunset, midnight. So if you do it twice a day, maybe 6. If you do it once a day, maybe 12. I don't know. The point is, though, I will make the case how important it is that left and right are balanced. Super critical. Number 2, it's this principle of building your own inner fire. Stop worrying about the world. Yeah, it's okay. You can be active. You can definitely commit yourself to making the world a better place than you leave it, to the best of your capacity. But number 2 principle is build your inner fire in the abdomen. Build that inner fire. More on that to come. Number 3, it's important that while you do these powerful techniques and working with prana and working with asana and bandha, as this energy starts to stir, that you take account of your own mind, your own patterns. You become more conscious of yourself, not necessarily the light, also the dark, the shadow. No matter how much you do these practices and confer or connect to your light self, positivity, kindness, compassion, illumination, no matter how much you do this, the teachings remind us that at any time, distractions will come. Temptations will pull you away. The Buddha, described in the life of the Buddha, after he attained enlightenment, 40 times he was visited by the Maras, by these demonic forces, if you will. One of the reasons he kept practicing was to hold fast to this narrow path. So all of us will have these moments, opportunities to be led astray. So, hold fast to self-inquiry, to self-study, to breaking down, and to getting clear about yourself. And this is a process of vichara, of intellectual, reason-based study of yourself. Not so much only what connects you to the light and makes you a positive, affirmative, wonderful human being, but those things that actually take you away from it. In what ways do your vikalpas, a vikalpa is a negative thought construct, shape your thoughts, your speech, and most importantly, your behavior, or perhaps the most important thing are your thoughts. Okay, so number 1, alternate nostril breathing, balancing left and right. Number 2, Number 2, inner fire. Number 3, self-inquiry. And the final piece here is spirituality. There must be a component, and the teachings, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika again, even makes the case for this, how important it is that we soften ourselves, we humble ourselves through reverence. And this is the tricky one, because people can drift into bhakti and to do all sorts of practice. It's fine. The point is, I can't tell you how to do it. Everyone to their own approach to it, at their own speed. But in order for these practices to be, again, assimilable, that you can bring them into your life and they can produce the wonder and the awe, that you can actually embody the grace of the world beyond the known, it requires that we appreciate it. Remember, I'm willing to suggest it's highly unlikely you remember asking to be here. You didn't actually create yourself to be here. Something is giving you and maintains your life. Every day is a gift. We should all remember that. And the mystery of what we go to when we leave this world is also part of this field of the unknown. And in some way, bring that into your practice. Let it soften your heart. Let it humble you. That's actually described in these teachings. And so is the process of self-inquiry and greater self-understanding. And so is the process of developing the inner fire at the navel so you can diminish those aspects of you that are not supporting you, to find and discover who you really are, and to tap into those potential forces that unleash your capacity, your true, limitless potential. When I finished that talk, I said, this woman came up to me and said, there's so much confusion. And she began to share a little bit of her story. She had practiced this modern version of Kundalini Yoga, of what's called Kundalini Yoga. But I would say that so much of the tradition gives us a clear map to practicing in a way that allows us to integrate this wisdom. And most importantly, please understand that ultimately Kundalini Yoga, it's not an other thing. I close this conversation by asking you to really take this in. That the Kundalini is not different than you. It's not a principle of dualism. So it's not like you and then this awakeness. This awakeness, this absolute expression, this absolute living presence of consciousness isn't right at the edge of you and then there's you. It's about really recognizing that Kundalini is you. In fact, even ask another question. If the absolute is limitless, if it's everywhere, if consciousness, singularity, is everything, is all pervasive, is there really a you separate from it? So many teachers have said it, that the great illusion of the ego is that there is one, that we are separate. So therefore, even the idea that you are doing the practice in order to wake up to that, this whole thing I've talked about through this whole conversation, that you are doing the practice in order to wake up to that, the non-dualistic view would hold that it is doing the practice, that you are not separate from it. And that's the final thing to take into this practice, that what you appreciate as the absolute is you, and you are it, and it is doing the practice through you, through what we think of as us. So I hope that helps. I guess what ultimately informed me, inspired, and motivated me to do this conversation is that this woman conveyed the idea that now I've heard in the last few years, that many people have turned away from what was called Kundalini Yoga, this brand of yoga, and turned away from the name because of what's unfolded in the last, some revelations about the teacher who popularized the brand. But please understand, please take this away. I can't make the case that what was actually being taught as Kundalini Yoga, the brand, was Kundalini Yoga. I've taken this time to outline the traditional approach to true Kundalini Yoga, outlined in the wisdom and the tradition of Tantra, thousands of years old. So I can't make the case that what was being called Kundalini Yoga was Kundalini Yoga. There's much evidence that it really wasn't based on tradition. It wasn't. And by the way, I practiced it, the brand, in my early days, early 1979, 80, 81. And I can tell you what I learned from my teachers who shared with me much of the science that I've given you, and most of what I've given you is through my own research, my study of the scriptures, my practice, and of course, the guidance of my teachers. So, what motivated me was this idea that people are turning away from the practice of Kundalini Yoga, or have made these summary judgments about what it is, even though they've only had a limited amount of experience with something that may or may not have actually been related to the traditional understanding and wisdom that is Kundalini Yoga. My hope is that this conversation will inspire and invigorate you to practice to do these practices of Hatha Yoga, Bandha, Mudra, Asana, and indeed, yes, Kundalini Yoga, to not turn away, because truly, this is the pinnacle. This is the top of the mountain of practice, is to awake to the infinite, to sleep, to put division aside, to rest in the absolute, to see what is normally invisible, and to let that vision grace your life and grace your days and help you be more loving, more kind, more strong, and be a force for good. Because truly consciousness is that. It's what binds us in love and in wisdom. Thank you.